Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. We're continuing to look at the games of Emanuel Lasker, second world champion. He is playing with the black pieces and his opponent is the American chess player Frank Marshall, who is playing with the white pieces. Now the game starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5 going into a Ruy Lopez, knight f6 going into the Berlin defense, and then we have d4. Now Reti comments that d4 is usually a very good move at trying to open up the position, but only really once black has played d6. He says that if you play d4 a bit too early, if you play d4 before it's prepared, then black may later have the opportunity to push d5 themselves. And d4 has been played at this position at the highest level. However, I think it's not a losing move, but it does immediately equalize for black. And we sort of see how Lasker is able to take advantage of this with this future d5 themselves. So we have e takes d5, castles, bishop to e7, and now Marshall pushes e5. And Reti comments that this e5 push needs to be quite carefully planned, because this e5 pawn is going to be quite easily overextended, and he offers quite a bit of analysis into the pawn being on e5 later on. Now here we see knight to e4, knight takes d4, castles, knight to f5, and now d5. And now this is a position which Reti talks quite a bit more about the pawn structure, especially this pawn on e5. So first of all we have with the white pawn on e5 and the black pawn on d5. Reti comments that very often after black has exchanged their e-pawn for white's d-pawn, black is very often able to get in this d5 pawn push, which he's done so now. Now usually when black plays the d5 pawn push, white's pawn is actually on e4, at which point white will usually have a choice. Do they keep the pawn on e4, keep the tension, do they exchange it for this pawn, or do they push to e5? Now obviously in this position white's pawn is already on e5, so he hasn't really got that choice. He could choose to exchange it, however, en passant. So Reti talks quite a bit about this pawn now. He says that on e5 it can be very useful having a pawn here, because this knight ideally wants to be on the f6 square. From f6 it guards h7, it also blocks up the f file if it needs to, and it is free to jump to g4 to aid in the attack, to jump to e4, or d5 to try and control the center or aid in any attacks. f6 is almost the ideal square for a knight before any of the other pieces are developed and before any attacks are in place. And this e5 pawn stops a knight being there. So a pawn on e5 can be very useful if you are attacking the opponent. However, Reti comments that it's only really useful in attacking if you have a significant lead in development or if you have the initiative, because otherwise this pawn is currently on its own. It's quite lonely here. It's going to be a target of attack, and so it's a weak point in the white position, which means that if black has the time to try and attack this pawn, then the pawn will prove to be a weakness for white. Whereas if black doesn't have the time to attack this pawn, perhaps the pawn is pushed with a tempo and white is able to immediately start an attack on the king side, then this pawn will be a strength. Now of course white can defend the pawn by pushing f4. However, Reti comments that this would just block in this dark square bishop, and may not be too advisable. And also, black always has the option of pushing f6 and trading the f pawn for the e pawn, and therefore opening the f file for their rook. So consequently, e5 is a potential strength for white or a potential weakness, and that's why you have to be very careful when you're pushing the e pawn or any pawn to e5, or to, if you're black, pushing a pawn to e4, because it can be lost. It can prove to be the downfall, it can prove to be a weakness in your position, or it can prove to be a very strong pawn. I believe Kasparov once evaluated a pawn here as being equivalent to a piece. However, the pawn has to be prepared. It has to be, you have to be able to follow up this e5 pawn push with some form of initiative, some form of attack. And if you are behind in development or even equal development, then black will often be able to attack this pawn, and you're going to struggle to defend it. It's going to prove to be a weak point. You have to be ahead of development. You have to be able to get an initiative. Ideally, you should be pushing this pawn with a tempo. Now here we see that Marshall takes on c6, taking the defender of the e5 pawn, an attacker of the e5 pawn, which sort of indicates that he hasn't really got any forcing combinations from this pawn, and that he's sort of seeing this pawn as being a bit of a weakness. It might not be overly strong. Now here he takes on e7, with queen takes, rook to e1, and now queen to h4. Now Reti comments that perhaps f3 may have been the better move, kicking away the knight, or perhaps f6 here may have been better for black as well, trying to exchange off this pawn to open up the rook. However, instead of playing f6 to try and exchange off this pawn and open up the rook, black immediately plays queen h4. The rook has moved to e1, removing a defender of this pawn. So therefore, black immediately enters potential complications. He says that although f6 may have been better than queen h4, oftentimes the simplest move and the best move will often lead to a draw. However, going for more complications would often be a better way to try and win. And likewise, he does also say that here Lasker sort of combines some of the positional elements with the tactical combinations. f6 may have been better to open up the rook, but he plays queen h4 instead, so he's going into sort of complications around the position. He says that even though the simplest and best moves may sometimes be the best, they will still draw. But likewise, even the combinational masterpieces of Adolf Anderssen that we saw before would perhaps be even less effective because they are lacking any of the strategic elements, until perhaps his later games. Whereas Lasker here tried to create complications, and he often mixed these complications with the strategic requirements of the position. Now here, Lasker sees that the rook moving to e1 removes a guard of the f2 square, and he also notices that black has the potential to open up the f file. So he uses this to immediately start an attack on this f2 point. So here we see bishop to e3, and now f6 going to open up this rook, adding further attackers to this pawn. We see f3, defending the pawn and kicking away the knight. And now we see f takes e5. After f takes e4, we see d4, and now g3. And Reti comments that Marshall probably didn't quite recognize that he couldn't save this bishop at this point. He probably thought he could try and get away with this bishop. However, if Marshall perhaps saw all of the potential combinations, he probably would have sacrificed this bishop back and played something like queen e2. Queen e2 is actually the computer move, and it actually indicates that white is slightly better in this position. Of course, they're going to be losing this bishop, but it's going to be back down to equal material. and black would arguably have a worse pawn structure. But Marshall tries to cling onto this bishop, so he first plays g3, attacking the queen, trying to move it away. We see queen to f6. It's worth noting, actually, in this position, why didn't he just retreat the bishop? Well, after bishop to d2, bishop to g4 would come, attacking the queen. The only square the queen can move to is c1. But now, after rook f2, white's in a lot of trouble now. The combination given is something like bishop to g5, attacking the queen, just trying to get essentially trying to sacrifice, or just trying to move the queen out the way. But even this actually leads to a mate in 5. After rook takes g2, king takes g2, bishop to h3 check, king h1, and now queen f2, threatening mate in 1. The only way white can defend that is rook g1, but after this check, the rook's forced to block, and then we still have mate. So that's a combination which Reti gives after this bishop g2. The bishop g4 attacking the queen, and then you bring the rook to the 7th rank, and the mate in 5 after this position. After this position. So that's why bishop d2 doesn't immediately work. So instead he plays g3, attacking the queen, trying to push it away. So we have queen to f6, keeping a threat on this f2 square and keeping control of the open file. And then we have bishop takes d4. Now even now, trying to retreat the bishop doesn't work because queen f2. The bishop is guarding f2 here. So retreating it allows queen f2 check. After king h1, bishop to h3, the threat is again mate in 1. But after rook g1, h5, and Reti comments that this is the difficult move to spot for white, and is probably what Marshall missed, this h5 pawn push. And he hasn't really got a good way to respond to it. If he takes on h5, then we can play queen takes, followed by mate. If instead he tries to attack the queen, again we have the exact same motive. If he just plays something like knight a3, then bishop g4 would come, attacking the queen. After queen c1, again you may have this same motive. I have no idea what I just did there. Queen c1, sorry, yeah, bishop f3 check, rook to here, and then you have mate. The only way you can really guard against things is by playing rook to f1. But after bishop takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook to a to f8, black's probably a bit better here. The black has a worse pawn structure, but is far more active. So black's probably a bit better here. But it was this pawn move that Reti comments that Marshall likely missed from afar. So back when he played g3, he probably didn't quite see this pawn move, which is why he played g3. But when he's in his position now, he probably now is able to see a bit clearer. And he hasn't really got any choice but to take on d4 because of the f2 check. So we have bishop takes d4, e takes d4, rook f1, and now Lasker trades down into an endgame. And so we have an endgame now. It's equal material. Black has 2 double pawns, 3 pawn islands, and white has 3 pawn islands, but no double pawns. However, the key factor here is activity. Black is able to get his pieces out a lot faster. Now here Reti comments that you may see a lot of people play something like bishop h3 check, and then immediately rook f8. And he comments that this might be a very obvious way to develop. You're developing your pieces very quickly with a tempo. However, he comments that this is perhaps a slight mistake, because you don't actually know where this bishop wants to be. It can be good on h3, but it can also be very good on a3. Sorry, on a6. And you don't quite know exactly where you want it just yet. And you don't have to develop it straight away. You're not going to... Black's not going... you're able to keep... So here we see that Lasker is able to develop his rook to b8 first, being patient with his bishop, and he's able to keep the bishop moves in reserve. And even though this bishop stays in the back rank for a little while, actually Black remains far more active. And we'll see how, you'll see what I mean. So here he plays rook b8, immediately seizing control of the open file and threatening rook takes b2. A rook on the 7th rank would just be devastating. So we see b3, and now rook to b5. And now this rook is dominating this entire 5th rank. The rook is free to move wherever it is and make as many threats as it likes. So here we see c4. Now, the combination which Reti gives is if perhaps you played quite normal moves, something like knight d2, developing a knight, hoping to bring the rook out. This may be quite a bit more obvious, but Reti comments that it's not really as effective. Something like rook h5 might then occur, and after the king defends, you may then have like rook c5. And again, pushing the pawn will give black a passed d pawn. So we're looking at white alternatives to pushing this pawn. So rook c1, and now bishop a6. And now we see the reason behind keeping this bishop on c8. The bishop can now go to there, because this rook will be pinned. So if you go to here, just pass a move, bishop d3 is a potential real threat here. If you take, you just down an exchange. And how are they going to defend this pawn? They haven't really got many good options to defend it at all. You know, if they try and block, well then you can just take and win a pawn. So instead of playing knight d2, white played c4, essentially defending this pawn immediately by pushing it to c4, because it was the only way that white saw to defend this pawn. And that was sort of the beauty of leaving this bishop on c8. Lasker saw that he may have potential options. He didn't know whether he wanted it on a6 or on h3, and he wanted to keep the option in reserve. So here we see rook to h5, king to g1, and note that black is still ahead in development. Black is still more active, even though he still hasn't developed his bishop. And now we see c5. c5 protects this passed d4 pawn. It does block the 5th rank. That's important to note. However, the 6th rank is open for the rook if it chooses to drop back there. And also importantly, it places the pawn on the 2 dark squares. So Lasker has a light square bishop, so he wants his pawns on dark squares, so he can move his bishop around more freely, and so he can try and fix the white pawns on light squares so they become targets for the bishop. And now we see knight to d2, and now king f7. It's black almost has to play king f7 now, because if black just developed the bishop, then rook f1 would make it very difficult for black to be able to get the king out. So he almost has to play king f7 now before white can cut the king off. We see rook f1 check, king e7, keeping control of the 7th rank. And now we see a3, rook to h6, moving back one so the rook can slide across as needed. h4, defending this pawn, hoping to free up the king. And now rook to a6, attacking this pawn. Now we have rook to a1, defending the pawn, and now bishop g4. So black develops the bishop. He knows exactly where he wants the bishop, and he's remained very active. Although he's only just moved his bishop, black has been the one who has had so much more activity in this endgame. Now here we have king f2, king e6, a4 defending the pawn. Now king e5. Note this pawn is defended by the knight. King g2. And now rook to f6, rook to e1, and now d3. So black has got his pawn, his bishop, controlling the d1 square. It's also able to jump to e2 to defend the pawn. He's got his rook on the open file, which also cuts off the king, and he's got this king centralized on e5, ready to potentially go to d4. So the passed pawn will be supported by the king. Rook to f1, and now king d4. Again, supporting the passed pawn with the king. Now rook takes, pawn takes, king f2, and now we see why black didn't mind exchanging the rooks. And Reti it doesn't say why black didn't mind exchanging rooks, but he does comment on its position as a whole. He says that pieces like bishops, rooks, and queens can move around the board whilst keeping control of certain key points. So this bishop could move up and down this diagonal whilst keeping control of d1. It could go to d1 and then snatch off some of these pawns if the knight wasn't defending, and it would stay in control of d1. However, the kings and the knights, they can't really move that freely without losing control of a key point. In fact, if this knight moves, then this knight has no way to move and defend this e4 pawn. Likewise, the king here is currently stopping the black king getting into e3. So if this king moves, as soon as this king moves, the black king can get in. So that's the main difference, whereas that's why Lasker didn't really mind exchanging the rooks, because he's able to... There's a few key points in the position. There's this pawn, which is a key point, and there's this square, which is a key point, which black wants to get to. And because this bishop is able to move freely, whilst defending this pawn and this key square, he's able to put white into a bit of a zugzwang later on. So here he plays c6. We see a5, a6, closing off, stopping the pawn advancing any further. Now here we have knight to f1. The knight moves, so as we discussed, the king can immediately take. Now we have king to e1. Now here we have bishop to e2, defending this, knight to d2 check, and king to e3. And white, again, is forced to move. If not now, then they'll be forced to move later on. So here we have knight to b1. Now, Lasker wants his king to get to f3 to start taking these pawns, because this king is going to be permanently tied down to the defense of this d-pawn queening. Now here we see knight to b1, but Lasker isn't in any rush to move to f3 and start taking these pawns. Instead, he plays f5. He's stopping any and all counterplay of Marshall. He's trying to fix the position, and essentially he's not rushing. He's quite calmly, he knows he can move to f3 when he wants to. He knows that's an option. And so he's quite calmly just continuing to reduce white's potential counterplay. We see knight d2, h5, knight b1, and now we see king f3. So now he's able to take these pawns, and there's nothing that white can really do about it. This pawn is protected by the bishop. It's a fairly easily won game now, and it's therefore in this position, Marshall resigns. So there we have it. It's one of the first more detailed endgames I think we've looked at in the book. Game number 27, and it's sort of indicative of the role of exchanging pieces. At least the endgame is how the knight and the king are perhaps limited by their ability to defend certain points, whereas the bishop is a lot more free. And so we saw how Lasker was able to use this knight versus bishop imbalance to try and, not try, to succeed in winning the position and winning these pawns. So that's game number 27. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time for game number 28. Thank you for watching.